Welcome to our book chat featuring Wole Talabi, the author of Shigidi and the Brass Head of Obalufon, and Ayanna Lloyd Banwo, the author of When We Were Birds, and our host, Abdulkareem Baba Aminu. Please give them a special Ake welcome.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Abdulkareem Baba Aminu, and I'll be I'm the lucky guy who will be talking to these fantastic writers on both my sides. Both of their books, interestingly, are debuts. They're both set in worlds that they seem, they strike you as familiar initially, and then they become fantastical, and then they play with you. So I had a very major blast reading the books, and I'm quite happy that we're going to be talking about them. The first question is for Ayanna. Ladies first. How did the story for When We Were Birds come to you? I don't say the inspiration, but you know what I mean.
Is this on? Yeah. Hello, thank you. Thanks so much for having me. It's been amazing being here. So much of when a story starts is a kind of mystery. And depending on who asks and when they ask and how far they ask, somehow I think the answer gets further and further away. So I think the first time when somebody asked me that, I was like, oh, okay, it was this year. And then I realized, oh no, hold on. I remember writing about Laperouse Cemetery and writing about graveyards in 2014. And so it's a way that stories are a kind of accumulation of things that you've been thinking about for years, before you even kind of put pen to think, okay, I'm writing this story. But I suppose the correct or the technical answer would be maybe in 2016, 2017. Wrote a short story about a man who was a much older man than Darwin is, and who was raised Rastafari and abandoned his faith since he was a young man in his 20s and had been working in a graveyard. And it was a short story. It was just him moving through the space, kind of thinking about how did I get here? How has this become my life? How has this place become the place that I feel most comfortable in the whole world? And I put it down and went to do my master's and thought I went to write a totally different novel when I went to do my master's. And I kind of had this short story that I felt it wasn't finished, it wasn't done. I wasn't sure if this was where it ended. I wasn't sure if this is who this man was. I wasn't sure if I'd figured out who he was. And so I took it to workshop, and everybody said, I don't know what you were planning to write this year, but this is a novel. This is the novel. And then, so that's when I started working on this book. I can't talk about when I started writing this novel without talking about Laperouse and without talking about my family's history with Laperouse Cemetery in Port of Spain, which is probably one of the oldest official cemeteries. You know, it have cemetery and then it have official cemetery. It have cemetery that's paperwork and gravestone and so on, and then they have cemetery that's not. So my family has been buried there for maybe going on 6 generations now. And so it means that this is a place where my dad and my ancestors on my mother's side in particular have been for a very long time, and where I found myself kind of going to see them. And so that short story that I wrote about Darwin walking around this cemetery was really, yes, was really born out of my walking around this place, trying to find where my people were buried because there were no headstones at the time. So, yeah, long story, short story.
Thank you, Ayanna.
Sorry, before you jump in, I was just going to say I think it's absolutely hilarious that my novel also started as a short story that I wrote in 2016.
Lies.
Providence.
Serious, yes. Short story called I Shigidi.
Ah.
Yeah. In fact, I wrote two stories, two separate stories about the two main characters. There was a story featuring Norma, just called Norma, and then another story called I Shigidi, and they were both published in 2016.
Wow.
And I was also figuring out, why am I writing about these characters? It was a bit random, it was a bit unpolished. I was still working through ideas, and then, yeah, 2016, and now look at us, we're here.
Magical, yeah. The thing about, I find, writing shorts is like you're trying to, Toni Morrison talks about writing at her desk and, talks. Nobody dies, talks. And looking out onto this river, this lake in front of her house. And she said she never knew what her characters were called until one day she would actually see them walk up out to the lake and walk into her house. And that's how she'd know what their name was. And so I think the process of trying to figure out a character, I think we're really writing those short stories. We're talking for them until they start to talk to us.
Yes.
It's only when they start to talk, then you could write the novel.
Yeah.
The short story, sometimes, at least for me, because I don't think I'm a short story writer. I think I'm more a long form writer, but I think that experience for me was one of, I'm trying to get them to talk. I'm trying to figure out who they are until they can say, okay, no, you're actually wrong. This is me.
Yeah.
Thanks. So Wole, this is for you. I first encountered your work, mostly hardcore sci-fi, short stories, a collection here and there. So boom, you just give us Shigidi, which is fantasy.
Sneak attack.
What happened? How are you playing in a whole new sandbox and so well?
Almost everybody familiar with my work feels, I don't know, betrayed, blindsided. They're like, you've been writing science fiction, we've been following your work, we're waiting for like this big 200,000, 250,000 word science fiction, philosophical space opera, and then you spring like a urban fantasy on us. Like, what are you doing? And the answer is just I couldn't stop writing the characters. The characters kept coming back. And also for me, I entered science fiction writing more from thought experiments. That's why I do short form science fiction very well, is I have an idea. And I think, okay, this is an interesting idea. All I need is a single setting to explore it a bit, and I'm done, right? So for me, science fiction stories are like thought experiments. With fantasy, it tends to be a bit more character-led. So I actually have written a few fantasy stories before. They're a bit lesser known, even though actually Lola knows at the King Prize nomination was for a fantasy story, not science fiction. So, and that's where I first met Lola in person. So there's a connection there. There's an Ake Festival connection. But for fantasy stories, I tend to come at them less thought experimentally and more character driven. And with this character, the two main characters in the novel, it should really be called Shigidi, Norma, and the brass head of Obalufon, because Norma is basically co-protagonist in the book, but then it got too long, and it kind of, it broke the whole thing. But basically, the two characters kept coming back to me, and I wanted to explore them a bit more. So I typically say there's three things that happened that made me write the novel. One is the character of Norma, who I really wanted to explore. Influenced a lot by like 90s Nollywood movies. Neka the Pretty Serpent. Norma is literally a riff on Neka the Pretty Serpent.
And the spirit drinking activities.
Spirit drinking
was that
activities,
a bit of Anna Rice
that's
inspiration?
literally why. Not so much. No, it's Neka. That's why the sex magic, the succubus aspect is very important, because it's literally a riff on that.
Spoiler: one of the main characters is a succubus.
Yeah, I don't think that's a spoiler. It's not a spoiler.
It's there on the tin.
And then Shigidi, who's just an interesting character from the Yoruba pantheon, like a minor god. In fact, there's many variants that you will encounter of what
Basically
Shigidi
Shango's
is.
houseboy.
In my version of the story, yes. in different versions I've encountered, he's an aspect of Ishu, he's an aspect of Olorum, he's not even a god in some cases, he's just an effigy that you put in your house and you pray to. There's all sorts of variants, but I liked the nightmare god aspect the most, because literally his entire job is give nightmares, kill people. Like, be ugly, give nightmares, kill people. And I just first time I read that, I was just like, this is the worst job in the world.
And look good doing it, you know.
No, look terrible at first, and then look good. So, eventually, yeah, that's the second character part, and then the third one was literally at the Kane Prize ceremonies in London. I went with some of the other nominees to the British Museum, and I hated being there. I used to live in London, but I had never been to the museum. And then when I went that day, I was just like, I should be enjoying myself. I should be learning history and things, but I just kept having this feeling like these things shouldn't be here. Yeah. You know, it felt wrong. It's like looking at prisoners. It literally felt like I was being taken on a tour of a prison, right? And I was just like, yeah, nah, I feel like taking all these things away. And then when I went home, I was like, I wanted to continue Shigidi and Norma's story, so why not just have them do it? Why not have them do what I wanted to do, which is take stuff from the British Museum.
Rob them. Rob them.
Can you rob a robber, though? Is it technically stealing if you steal from someone that's so... But anyway. So literally that's why I set aside my science fiction ideas for a bit, and I was just like, I want to enjoy writing these characters, doing something that I felt very strongly like I wanted to do, and in the process explore them and their relationship as well.
Thanks, Wole. So the next question is more for Ayanna, but still quite very much for you because it's a conversation that's ongoing, and I find it pretty fascinating. It's that of genre. I couldn't quite put my finger on the genre, you know, of your book, and I wouldn't know where to find it in a bookstore, for example. It's so many beautiful things all at once. If maybe you could tell us what you feel the genre is, and then maybe we could talk a little bit more, as well as Wole, about genre these days, how they crisscross, they're blending a lot these days.
I mean, the whole thing about genre is really for two people: for people who are marketing the work, and people who are studying the work. That's really what these categorizations, for me anyway, are for. They don't really have anything to do with me. They don't really have anything to do with the process of making the work. They may help a reader who kind of has a sense of this is what I like to read. But then even that, I've had people, you know, I don't really mix up in the Goodreads world too much because, you know, mental health. But I mean, there are people who who pick up a book and then say, this is not what it's supposed to be. Because I was told that this was a romance, or I was told that this was science fiction, or I was told it was magical realism, you know, whatever that term means. That's a whole other conversation we could have. So yeah, I think what we are doing, and when I say we, I mean as, you know, the people who are my business, what black people, what African people are doing, what African diaspora writers are doing, is reclaiming our stories. We are writing our realities, we are writing our culture, we are rewriting, reimagining, and that don't always mean that we're necessarily writing fantasy, or we're because it's not fantasy. That doesn't mean we're writing magical realism, although I don't have too much fight with the term, because I think once you understand the evolution of the term magical realism, particularly when you're talking about Marquez' magical realism and Esquivel and Borges, is that what they're really saying, what magical realism is really doing, it is writing reality with all the elements of the ways it can be absurd, strange, miraculous, awful, terrible. I mean, in the Caribbean, saying to me that there is a family of women descended from Kobos, descended from vultures, from death, from carrion birds, sound like a story, but seem perfectly plausible to me. You know, my culture, my religious background, that is not fantastical. That is depending on who decides that it's fantastical. The fact that I mean, you even walk around any black diaspora city, it had things that don't make sense, you know. It's that thing you walking around and you say, wait now. To a stranger, it don't make no kind of sense, but because we know it, it means it is our reality, and it is just as valid and just as real and just as plausible and just as worthy of making into art as anything else. So yeah, I mean, I try to mind my business in the world, you know. I try to do my work, to write for who I write for, to write what I want to write about, and not and let the people who are paid to see about those things, about genre and where they put it and where on the shelf, and let them see about that. You know, yeah.
You know, I share the sentiment a lot. I think, like you said, genre is for, academics and booksellers, not really for writers. And I think the idea of where genre comes from is, like you said, it's setting expectations for readers, but it also comes from a kind of thinking that I think infects the scientific world as well. I see it a lot, where we try to break ways of understanding the world, what we would call natural philosophy. We say, well, we're going to subdivide, and this is chemistry, and this is physics, and this is biology, and they're all these clean boxes. When you really start studying it, they're all related. The chemistry makes the biology, but the fundamental physics is what drives the chemistry. And at the end of the day, the entire world is one thing and has to be observed in the entirety. So mixing genres to me is natural, right? That's whatever it is. You observe fantastically or with a more precise naturalistic lens, or you really want to go all out and emphasize how, you know, fantastical and surreal the world can be. They're all aspects of the same thing. And these subdivisions, they help in understanding certain aspects, but they're not the truth, right? I think that's the problem I have sometimes when people say, this genre, there's a clean border here. If you do this, you've made it science fiction. If you do that, you've made it fantasy. If you've done this, you've made it literary. There's no such thing. None.
Just book.
It's just book. It's just a story. It's just all story at the end of the day. And I mostly write science fiction. I use that as a marker because that's what people recognize it as. But if you read almost all my science fiction work, there's elements of what people would call fantasy in it as well, right? And so I don't think it's a very useful distinction, except when people are trying to sell books, in which case I give them a book that has
Categorize me all day long, what you
fantasy,
gonna sell.
urban fantasy, bits of romance, whatever. Please put me in all the categories. Sell my book
All of
everywhere. It's
them.
fine. I'm good. Please do all. Right? Which genre are you? All of them.
So a quick exercise. Between the two books, how many of us here have read one of the two? Or both? Nice.
Only this side of the
Now,
gonna say
those
this
who, the people on the nice seats, no,
That's what Jeep
haven't
says.
read nice seats.
Yeah.
So, no, she said it. It wasn't me. I promise.
not.
It was okay, Swawana.
That just means
So-
I'm talking to all you now because I want all you to buy it. So right, I'm facing
Exactly. Yeah, you're already, you know. It's how do they say it in French? It's got the both books have je ne sais quoi. You know, I just can't put they're just incredible. I felt very lucky. I was telling them earlier when LS sent the books, you know, I don't know if I would have on my own picked your book up because I had not seen it before. But I definitely would have. I did actually before the festival. And you know that I can't emphasize how much you're missing if you don't read these two books. They feel grounded, and at the same time you're in new worlds. The characters are very, very well written, you know, believable. So when you're saying what you're saying about your process, I was like, oh, that's the alchemy, you know, that you're doing. And the next question is going to be a very selfish one. I would love to hear you guys read from your books, just once each. Then we continue with the rest of the questions. So, as always, ladies first. You need a copy?
I have one. Thank you. I've been finding myself behaving like an old lady this morning. I dig it in my bag. I couldn't find my glasses, and I said, I said, at some point in the conversation, I would know what I felt like reading, and I don't. But I'm going to read, and I know it's not too long. I'm going to read a little, no, maybe I'll read a shorter bit. I'm going to read a little bit from quite a way into the book, actually. Yajide, oh, this is so nice. So this is the first place that I've read where I'm probably not pronouncing Yajide's name properly, and you all probably know how to pronounce it better than I do. I'm doing all right. Okay, right. Praises. This is the first time I'm somewhere. I'm like, everybody knows who I'm talking about. Okay, so this is quite a ways into the book, but spirit movement, and she is at a ceremony of sorts where this is a part of the celebration or the homegoing of her mother's death. Her mother is Petronella. And yeah, let me just let it go. Yejide. Dusk drape her head like a shawl. For the last 9 nights, she carried Petronella lockets cold on her breastbone and Granny Catherine pipe heavy in her pocket. The smoke don't bother her now, and the burning tobacco taste sweet behind her throat. Since she's small, these 3 days, All Saints' Eve, All Saints' Day, and All Souls' Day, always feel special to her. Wasn't until she was in high school that she hears some of the other girls from town talking about going to Halloween parties, whatever other people call it. The holiday have a magic on Montmarie. Agatha and Angie would cook and they would all gather in the living room. Granny Catherine would tell stories and Mr. Homer would play music. Was those days she would hear about Deborah and baby girl and mama and all their lovers and their sisters and their kin. And so for Petronella Wake to fall on those sacred days, she couldn't plan it better. Yejide leave the locket open so Petronella and Geraldine faces could be out in the cool air. Mr. Homer turned to her. We could make a start whenever you're ready, Jide, although he looked up to the sky. We should catch it before full dark. She tapped the pipe against her thigh and nodded. They gather on the front porch of the house, all dressed in white. Seema, Peter, Agatha, Angie, Lawrence, and Mr. Homer each carry a handful of white candles. Mr. Homer handed Yejide the first candle, and she passed the flame from Granny Catherine's silver lighter on the bottom to soften it. She paused and looked up at Mr. Homer. Are doing this right? Is this the way? He nods, and she crouched down and placed the candle onto the step. Then Mr. Homer raised his voice and speak into the night air. And now let us call the ones who have come before us, who are here still with us, and will be here after we are dust. Yejide passed the flame once more around the bottom of the candle to make sure it stands steady on the concrete, then light the wick and watch the wax pool melt and run down the gallery step. Petronella Mavis St. Bernard. She said the name soft into the flame. She of two faces. She was here with us and not at the same time. She grieved and grieved till it too heavy to carry, looked to the gathering storm and take to her bed, her sister's name on her lips. The flame buck and sputter, then swell and hold. Yejide looked to Peter, now waiting on the step below her, candle in hand. He followed her lead, taking the light from her candle to his and pressing it to the ground. Catherine Adara St. Bernard, he whispered into the flame, the dear one. Stop the car in the middle of traffic on the way to town to check inventory for the coming week. Unlock the door, look toward the hills and the darkening sky, and walk in the direction of Montmarie. She spoke to no one until she had come all the way up through the village, through the hallways of the old house, and into the master bedroom. This flame don't sputter one bit, just burns strong and steady. See my hands shake before she lights her candle with Peter flame, but her voice smooth. Deborah Mariah St. Bernard. The flame swelled big and wild, nearly catching a lock of Seema hair before coming down to size again and burning quietly. Her brown legs was wrapped around the hips of her longtime lover. She paused in mid-stroke, sniffed the air, climbed off him, put her clothes on, and walked out of his house. The wind had already started to set up before the man could even pull on his pants. Usually think she hear a little of Seema's old self in those words, a touch of mischief and laughter. But before she could catch her eye, Agatha cupped the flame in her hand and light the next candle. A small sputter and the flame turned blue. Her voice a smoky croon. Sandra, baby girl, Saint Bernard. She was telling her daughter the best way to soak the fruit for black cake one Christmas when she stood up from her chair on the front porch, kissed Deborah on her forehead, pull a wad of rolled up bills from her brassiere, and hand them to the child, just as the wind began to blow. Angie sit on the last step. She barely touched the flame to the wick, but it catch with one word. Mama, the first, the one who bring the fire. 1 minute she was clearing bush outside with a tree-lined machete sharpened by her own hand. And the next she look up at the gathering clouds, drop the blade, leave the bush half cut, and take to her bed. The black smoke from the tip of the flame soared into the dusky air. Mr. Homer walked to the bottom of the steps, and Laurence walked behind him, candle in hand. He picked up his goatskin drum from the ground and stand on the grass in front of the house. We say their names together on this day to make sure they stay with us, that they don't forget themselves and the promises they have made. We have promises to keep too. We speak only of the manner in which they died. We speak to no one about how they lived or how they learned to fly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ayanna. Yeah, good luck topping that.
Thank you. No pressure. So, I was trying to decide which part of the book to read. I still haven't decided. But I kept thinking, oh, should I read the part that actually takes place in Lagos, since I'm in Lagos? But I'm not going to do that. I am going to read from the opening of the novel because I think it's just the right length for this. It's relatively short. All right. Northumberland Street, London, Spirit Side, England, July 5th, 2017, 4:40 a.m. So, there he was, barely conscious in the back of a black cab, being driven down the Haymarket Road on the Spirit Side of London by a man who had died 70 years ago when Norma finally told Shigidi that she loved him. He would have laughed if he wasn't already half past dead. The driver downshifted gears and swept the hackney carriage so sharply and violently that the two left side tires lifted off the ground. Shigidi lost his balance and toppled over into her thighs, pressing the wound where his arm used to be and leaving an ugly red stain on her lovely blue dress. A smear of blood, clay, and spirit particles. The contact made every muscle in his body contract. He felt like he was being torn apart from within, as if his insides were being separated from each other by an angry, pain-shaped animal. He was forced to lift his head out of her lap to shout out some of the hurt, and the sound that came out of him was strained and strange. It was a sound he didn't recognize, even though it was not the first time he had screamed out in agony. The spike of pain cleared just enough for him to stop screaming. I don't know how much longer I can hang on to what little consciousness I have left. But bright light was spilling in through the windows, accompanied by a sound like the beating of the old Oyo Empire war drums. It was almost funny, because he had once used those same fearsome sounds as inspiration a long time ago when the Oni of Ife had sent him to give nightmares to 6 of his enemies. But Shigidi was no longer a nightmare god. He still remembered what it was like to weave the disparate myriad threads of deep-seated personal fears into a tapestry of terror and pain and uncertainty. And he still knew what it felt like to be caught inside such a web, desperate to wake. Everything about this feels like a nightmare. In the blur of movement and disorientation, he caught a glimpse through the rear window. The sky was a maelstrom of thick neon-edged clouds and constant flashes of electric white lightning set against a pitch-black sky full of thick clouds. No god could hope to reign over such wild sky. And down on the ground, 4 bronze horses with flames for eyes were galloping madly behind them, leaving a train of broken asphalt, sparks, and fire in their wake. A large, angry figure rode behind the horses, driving them forward with vicious purpose. A bronze rope ran all the way to the horses' straying throats and was wound tightly around the imposing figure's arm, his feet braced in the back half of a crudely bisected gray sedan, giving chase in what was a makeshift chariot. Shigidi's vision swam. The glare from the horse's eyes became nothing more than after images superimposed on a million others, but he could tell that they were fast, faster than any flesh and blood horses could ever hope to be, and they were drawing closer. But their cab driver was supposed to know the spirit side of London better than anyone else, living or dead, or kind of both. And so Shigidi hoped that that knowledge would be enough to get them to the rendezvous point before dawn, before the life leaked out of him completely. I don't want to die in a foreign spirit land. And just then, the driver swung the wheel wildly, forcing the car to swerve right, barely missing 2 ghosts in long gray frocks. The cab careened down a short flight of stairs before reconnecting with actual road and re-accelerating again. Shigidi fell back into his lover's lap and his head bounced against the car door so hard that he feared it had cracked open. "Careful," Norma shouted at the driver as she pressed her hand into Shigidi's and pulled his head into her bloody bosom. "Sorry, I'm doing my best here, love," the driver called back. "But in case you haven't noticed, we are being chased by 4 living statues and 1 pissed-off giant." She ignored the driver and whispered into Shigidi's ear. "Hold on, my darling. I love you. Do you hear me? I love you. Just hold on. Everything will be okay. We're almost there." Stunned, he forced his eyelids open and looked into her eyes, shimmering with a glaze of tears and the reflection of bright yellow spirit particles. He wanted to embrace her too and tell her he loved her, the way he'd imagined he would when she finally said the words to him. But his tongue felt swollen and numb in his mouth, saturated with the sharp taste of iron and clay. He could still hear her. He was still mostly there. But her voice sounded woolly and far away, and the galaxy of blurry lights reflected and refracted around him were becoming too bright. He could barely feel his arm, or his legs, or his face, or his anything anymore. "I guess my time is running out even faster than I thought." He hacked out a blood-stained cough. "But it's not too bad. I suppose there are worse ways to die than in the arms of someone you love." A force slammed into the vehicle with a deafening sound like an explosion made of other explosions. The driver let out a primal scream that Shigidi could barely hear above the cacophonous violence of metal crunching against metal, the shattering of glass, the screeching of rubber on asphalt. And in that moment, he knew they were done for. So he focused on the thing that mattered most to him, her. His eyes remained fixed on her face as the world around them turned into a chaotic galaxy of smoke and metal and glass. And then when he could barely see her anymore, he shut his eyes against the army of white lights invading his consciousness and braced himself for what he was sure would be the final, endless fall into nothing. "I love you too, Norma, and I'm sorry for everything. This is not how I thought this would end."
Incidentally, one of my favorite parts of the book, the very beginning. Yeah, it's so visual. Okay, so now, Shigidi is it's a high octane heist, story.
Medium
lots
octane.
of-
Medium octane.
Ah, it got me buzzing. It got me buzzing. I mean, that opening, come on.
And then it slows down a bit.
Nah,
I don't want to set false
I
expectations.
dwell on the high octane moments.
Okay.
And then when we were birds, haunting, quietly intense family drama, and the love story. It's also a love story. They're both love stories. They have that in common. And something else they have in common is that the two main characters, the main in both books. In your book, it's Darwin and Yejide, and then there's Shigidi and Neoma. They both have a lot of sex in the books. Yeah, so like
You can say it. Sex is fun.
I know. I say this because the sex scenes are interesting.
Interesting. Yeah.
So how was it, writing that?
Know my research process.
Like, you know, I enjoyed the book. I just want to get into their heads.
You're trying to get me in
In
trouble with my
public, by the
mother-in-law.
way. I enjoyed reading. So yes, how was it writing such? I don't know, and it actually made the characters more organic, more alive.
Oh, nice.
Where's Kina?
Well done. Well done.
Please take them away.
Security.
So yeah, how was it?
You know,
writing?
it's so funny that you say that because, one of the things, there's some people who've read it's like, the romance doesn't get going until maybe halfway. Hi. I'm just seeing people in the crowd. I'm like, oh, hello. The romance doesn't, there's a feeling maybe, if you're thinking of this as a romance novel, then you wonder for quite some time, hold on, where is it? When are they going to meet? When have they? And, one of the things that I loved about Darwin and Yejide's coming together quite late in the book, really, far later than it probably happens in real life, if to be fair, is that the whole of their relationship is far more. It's far more than flesh, if you want to, use that kind of word. It's that everything, the implications of their relationship is cosmic. Their coming together does work in the world. There are things that it does in the world. Their balance, their spirit connection, the unsettling and unsettled space in Port Angeles, which is the city that I've created to reflect Port of Spain, is dependent on the continuation of a lineage of this family. It's dependent on a man who can partner a woman who has important cosmic spiritual work to do. And I ain't no ordinary man. That's not ordinary human being that can take a back seat or a side seat, or who can support or who can hold the reality because she exists in the unreality. And so I think writing their love scenes and writing their scenes where they come together, and this is really one sort of main scene, couldn't be transactional and descriptive. It had to feel as though there was so much more happening here. And so it's always slightly cringy trying to write sex. You're like, oh, is it too much? Is it too little? Is it too weird? Is it too then you try to think about, okay, what happens next? It can be quite odd but yeah, I enjoyed it. I did.
Oh, I also enjoyed writing sex.
Okay.
So for me, the approach was, it's like I said, this was the character forward book. And once I had made that choice that I was writing a story about Norma, who is a succubus, like literally.
You kind of can't avoid it, right?
Exactly. It's built
It's
into
a
her
job
DNA.
description.
Like that is how she works. That's the source of her power. She manipulates lust and sex. So you cannot not have sex scenes. It wouldn't make sense for the character. It wouldn't make sense for the character to not have any sex scenes, or for the sex scenes to feel flat. Like, this is someone that's supposed to have been around for thousands of years. She knows what she's doing to manipulate people.
Many YouTube videos.
So I tried to write it that way, but I also tried to write it in a character forward way, because even though she's been around a long time, for her, using sex is a source of power. So it feels a powerful act. It's a way of controlling situations. And especially in the beginning of the book, when we first meet her, she's relying a lot on that because that's the way she's had to survive. So it's how she encountered Shigidi, it's how she tries to negotiate with people, is using sex as power. And as you get along more in the book, the sex actually drops off. I don't think there's any sex scene in the second half of the book because
She'll do
she's
check.
changing, right? Shigidi is not just the one changing, they're changing each other. And there's that kind of inversion somewhere in the midpoint. But at the beginning, it was important to establish that because, again, if I say she's a succubus and there's no sex going on, people will be like, what are you doing? Where's the succubus power? So, yeah.
Thank you very much. So it's funny how time flies. We're going to have to start the Q&A. I'm not even going to look in this direction. The VIPs are here.
Wow.
Our VIPs.
Wow.
Black
Wow.
women, black people and women here too. So yeah, it's open for a Q&A. So let's take questions one after the other. If you don't have any questions, I have more.
Can keep going.
Okay.
Oh, do we have one?
Mariam Laushi.
Hi.
Hello.
So I just love that your books are both based on what we as Africans find to be real to us and not fantasy, right? I'm not very knowledgeable about the Yoruba gods. I read Sanya, which I really enjoyed, and so I'm really looking forward to reading Shigidi and your book as well. So maybe I would like to know a little bit of what kind of research did you do to kind of find out about these historic gods or figures that we have as Africans? Did you talk to people? Did you do some reading? Was that easy to get information about them? Was it difficult? So just a little bit about that. Both of you, please. Thanks.
Ladies first.
It's weird to talk about making things up because that's a lie. You don't actually make anything up. At least for me, everything is a combination of things that you've read, stories that you've heard, myths, or that what we would have been told were myths or stories, when I was growing up. And there are just so many of them. So the central figure or mythology that my book hinges on is the idea that there are these women who used to be birds and who in essence really still are. And they're carrion birds. In Trinidad, we call them the kobo. And now there is no myth that I can point you to in Trinidadian, any stories that says this is how this death work happens. This is really a combination of bits and pieces of things that I've sort of thought about, read. I mean, so many cultures have stories about blackbirds, about carrion birds, that they're always associated with death. And one of the things that I really found was fascinating that really brought those characters to life for me was not so much the mythology of it, but the science of it. So carrion birds, part of why they're important to an ecosystem is that they're able to eat dead flesh. They're almost like cleaners. They're able to eat dead flesh and create a sort of clean, safe zone, and they don't get sick. They don't get sick. They don't die. Kobos don't have vocal cords in the way other birds have, so they don't have a song. They don't sing. They actually sound kind of creepy. They kind of grunt almost when they feed. They're quite ungainly looking birds. There's nothing about these birds that look like you see them. You think, oh, pretty bird now. They don't look like that. But when they fly, their wingspan is huge. But if you know anything about them, instead of feeling inspired, and so you actually feel quite apprehensive when you see them because you know there's carrion, something that's dead. And that could be anything from livestock to a person. It's one of those things, if you're looking for police investigation, looking for bodies, you look in the sky. You can do all your investigation, your forensics, but just look up, and it might give you a hint. So that was really what I kind of led with. I led with the physical realities of these birds, and then like everything else, because that's how our reality is. There's a spiritual side and there's a scientific side, and those two things aren't disconnected for me. Most of my research came from things like that, playing with little bits of legends that I read, stories that I read, and and actually being in a cemetery. As I said, my family has been buried there for many generations. Just before I started writing this book, we had three big deaths in my family: my mother, my father, and my grandmother. One a year. So it meant that I was really writing this book under the in the wake of these huge upheavals in our family. You know, when a grandmother dies, a library is gone, a whole story of a family, and she was really our anchor. You know, my mother and I were desperately in love. Oh my God, you know, I adored that woman, and her death was not just tragic. It was like waking up, and the and a mountain range was gone. So it meant that, um, and I mean, which is why Dad went 10 months after her. Dad was like, checking out, done, gone. So it meant that so much of what would be seen as research for me wasn't necessarily just reading books and going into a library. It was really thinking about how do we honor our dead? How do we remember our dead? What's our relationship with our dead? And um, and moving about a space that people don't go to often. You know, nobody goes to a cemetery unless they're burying someone or they bring in offerings. So it meant I was that weird person who walked around and talked, dropped by, talked to grave diggers. After a while, they got to know me. They'll see me and say, "Ah, you're all right, yeah, I'm good. We locking up soon, eh?" My cousin and I actually got locked in one night, which is a whole other story. Whole other story. And you know, yeah. We had to get a drink and talk about that one. but but yeah, so that was really my research process. It was remembering, it was being in a space, it was walking around, it was listening to people, it was observing people's funerals like a creep, and seeing how they dug the graves, how they kept them kind of propped up. It was being less afraid of writing grief and writing loss, and also writing the joy and remembrance and the beauty and that kind of love that transcends the body and transcends flesh and transcends what is seen as life and death. So that was my research.
Yeah, and
Wole.
I love that you mentioned the talking to people aspect, which is an underappreciated part of doing research, right? It's just talking to people. Everybody thinks research means, oh, you studied some books somewhere and you have like list of citations and references. For my own research, I did read a lot of books and I have lots of citations and references. But so the book is actually dedicated to my mother. On the first page, I literally say it's for her because she studied theology. Um, and I helped her a lot when she was studying in my teenage years. And I didn't understand half of what I was reading on theology and mythology, but it gave me the opportunity to read mythology from different parts of the world and also looking at different religions and how they form, and even things like different cults, just belief systems in general. So I absorbed a lot of that information early on. And I remember being a teenager, thinking through all this and having read lots of encyclopedias when I was young, how fascinating different mythologies are. Greek mythology, Hindu mythology was wonderful. But then we have, you know, I won't even call it Yoruba mythology because people still believe, but we have a pantheon of gods and belief systems and spirits that is just as complex and fascinating and full of really interesting stories that explore how we understand the world and how we embody concepts of the world in these figures. And I really wanted to kind of take that and then do something fun with it. Because a lot of the time when, you know, people encounter African authors, sometimes people are like, so, you know, what in your book can people learn about Africa? I'm like, I'm not your bloody teacher, man. Like, I'm not, I write for the same reason that I think most of us write. It's entertainment primarily, and it can educate as well. It can illuminate. You learn stuff about yourself when you write. But the primary objective was not to educate. So I wanted to take all that interest I had in the different pantheons, in all the stuff I had studied with my mom when she was doing theology and mythology, and then take them and abstract them. So it's inspired by Yoruba mythology, but it is not Yoruba mythology. I don't expect anyone to come up to me and be like, the version of Olorun in your book is canon, and you said something that we are not happy with. I'm like, do you really think that the Orishas operate like a company that has profit and loss statements? Because that's what I write in the book. I reimagine them as a capitalist entity operating in prayers as currency, right? It is an abstraction that I'm using for a separate layer of, criticizing the concept of capitalism and inherited colonial mindsets. That was one of the things I wanted to do with the book. But I took inspiration from the existing Yoruba pantheon because I had that desire to kind of show how rich it was. And in doing that, a lot of my research I mentioned came from, studying theology with my mom. But then more recently, there are several books that I found extremely useful, some from the 1920s, one by M.I. Ogumefu, which really details a lot of the older traditional beliefs and belief systems and what people associated each of the Orishas with. So that was one of my main reference books. There's others as well, but yeah, it was mostly books and, stuff I remembered from studying with my mom.
Miss Wana.
Hi.
Hello.
Hello. I often feel like the process of writing is also about like meaning making. And I'm very interested in how science fiction, fantasy, mythology, and how that meaning making works for you in terms of, you're working with imagination and also reimagination as well. Because I think for a lot of people it's making sense or making meaning from reality. But I'm just interested in how having all these worlds, right? And how that kind of influences your own idea of meaning making.
I have to be first.
I mean, only if you want to.
Yeah, no, you go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, so for me, meaning making from speculative fiction, right? When we say we deliberately want to write something that is not reality, right? In my book, that's clearly what I do. I'm taking from existing belief systems and abstracting them. And to me, the main thing that allows you to do is to explore by analogy, right? If you think about when you're studying in school, what do we often do to help people understand concepts and make meaning? We use metaphor, right? It's like this. Oh, imagine if it was like that. Imagine you are in a room with this situation. Okay, it's something like that. And it helps us, build some scaffolding of understanding using existing concepts to get at something else. So to me, science fiction, speculative fiction, fantasy is basically the literalization of metaphor. And with that literalization of metaphor, you can emphasize, you can de-emphasize, you can zoom in on a specific aspect of things. That helps make meaning. It's like looking at the world from a slightly different angle, depending on what you're trying to do. And for this book in particular, what I really wanted to do with the fantastical aspect is, as I mentioned, illustrate how rich the Yoruba pantheon is and how much you can play with it and have fun with it. But on another layer was to kind of look at what does being an entity in a capitalist, purely capitalist organization that has no other objective except to generate profit. What does that do to the people, right? And Shigidi is a victim of this in the beginning of the book, right? He's literally a cog in the machine, goes on jobs, gives nightmares, hates his job, barely sees anyone higher up in the company. And over time, he develops a really poor sense of who he is until he encounters Norma in the book. I feel like if we were just saying, we're just talking about someone that worked in a job that they didn't like. Yeah, we all know someone like that. That's some of us even, right? But by abstracting it to someone that is a god, literally working in a supernatural company, it emphasizes just how dehumanizing that process is, even for a god. So to me, the meaning making that you get from fantasy is in that using metaphor to either exaggerate, to make it clearer, or to emphasize certain aspects of things, and that's how I think it helps.
That's interesting, because as you just said, I suppose maybe I'm saying that it is real. I suppose that's my meaning making. I'm not abstracting. I'm not saying, if we look at fantasy like this, we can see this about the world. I'm saying that is the world. That is the world. We are spirit first. The energies that exist, that we that not that that is the bedrock of the thing that we are saying that is reality. So the fact that Darwin is a grave digger, and that he has been forced to, I suppose, like Shigidi in a way, he's been forced to do a job that is against the principles of his religion. He doesn't, somebody who's very orthodox Rastafari has no contact with the dead, with dead flesh. The fact that he is then placed in this position to do work that is, in a way, he may see as dehumanizing, but it is important spiritual work. It is important spiritual work to bury the dead with honor and with dignity. It's important spiritual work to be that kind of guardian of a space. Now, he may not see it that, he may not have seen it that way. But as the novel progresses, he becomes a guardian of sorts in a way that he would never have thought himself to be that way at all. So I suppose if it's any meaning, the way that what I'm sort of trying to do with the work is to say these African, Caribbean spiritual practices are vital, are important, are real, are the bedrock of who we are in the world, and attend to your dead. Attend to them. Because they are your connection, your tether, your strength, your all of those things. So I suppose maybe that's the meaning making that I'm trying to do with this work, and I'm quite deliberate about, sometimes I go to festivals or events or panels and so on, and I almost feel like I shouldn't be talking about this here, because you think I'm saying something cute, right? You think I'm being fantasy story, and I'm like, nah, not at all. This is reality that I'm writing. So I mean, yeah, I don't know if that answers your question 100%, but yeah, thank you.
So on that note, we're literally rounding up. We have 2 seconds left.
2 seconds.
Sorry. Yeah. So there's
One
another. No extra time. Yeah. Okay. So thank you very much.
You can ask me after. Ask
Time
after.
up. No time. Next panel.
Thank you.
Exactly. So please, there's book signing right after.